So we set everything up in the last lecture. Now let's create our form. Now we could initialize it right here to set a value immediately, but I don't like to do this here. I want to have it in a method because it actually is quite a lot of code and it's not the best place to have it right here at the top in the property declaration area. So I will use the onInit lifecycle hook for this. So I will import onInit, make sure to import it from @AngularCore, and therefore I'm required to implement the ng-onInit method, and in here I will initialize my form. You should initialize it before rendering the template, of course, so make sure to use a lifecycle hook which is called before the template is rendered. Here I will set up my sign-up form and will set it equal to what? Well, keep in mind, sign-up form is of type form group, so we need to create a new form group here, just like this. Now we have almost a valid form. We need to pass a JavaScript object here, and we're theoretically done. This is our first created form. This JavaScript object configures it, and as it's empty, it simply says, or it tells Angular, hey, this form doesn't have any controls. So let's add some. Controls are basically just key value pairs in this object we pass to the overall form group. So let's have a look at our HTML code. We have a username field and an email field, and then we got the radio buttons here at the bottom. So it would make sense to have a username control. I'm wrapping this in quotation marks to make sure that during minification, when this code gets mangled, this property name is kept because I will reference it in the HTML code. This might not be necessary, it might not get destroyed, but just to be sure, I'm wrapping it as a string. So here, what is this now? Well, this is a form control, another class made available by the reactive forms module, or by this forms package here, I should say. So I will set up or create a new form control here, and form control should also be added from the forms package from @AngularForms. Now to this form control constructor, we can pass a couple of arguments. The first argument is the initial state, the initial value of this control, you could say. The second argument will be a single validator or an array of validators we want to apply to this control. I'll come back to this. The third argument will be potential asynchronous validators. I will also come back to this later. For now, I want to set an initial state of null to have an empty field, but you could also pass a string like default username, and now this would later be displayed as a default username. Again, I'll keep it at null for now. Now, have a look at the template again. The next field is the email. So I'm going to add another control, another key value pair in this JavaScript object, which will also be a new form control. And here I will also set a default value of null. Again, validation will be added later. Now, gender, this is the gender the user selects, is also a new form control. It might be a radio button, but that is just a normal input in the end. So to Angular, it simply is a control. And here I could set this to null, but I want to select a default gender. So here I will actually select male because that's my gender. Feel free to pick female, of course, or add more genders to this array of genders up here to begin with. With this, a basic form is initialized. It has 3 controls, and that is all for now. This is our first basic form. Now in the next lecture, we're going to connect this form we created here in TypeScript to our form we have set up in the HTML code. In the last lecture, we created our form here in TypeScript. The issue is, it's nice to have it here, but our actual form, you could say, lives in the HTML template. So we somehow need to synchronize our HTML inputs and our own form, or this form in general with our own form. Right now, Angular doesn't know which of our TypeScript controls here relates to which input in our template code. It actually doesn't even know that our form, sign-up form here, should be attached to this form. Right now, the one thing it is doing is, it is auto-detecting that this is a form and it creates a form for us. Now, we don't want it to do that. So we have to add some directives to override this default behavior to give Angular different instructions. for these directives to work, you definitely need to make sure that you add the import to reactive forms module in your app module, otherwise you will get errors. Now, the first directive we need to add is here on the form itself, via property binding, the form group directive. Now, this simply tells Angular, hey, please take my form group. Don't infer one, don't create a form for me, use my form group. And we need to set up property binding here because we need to pass our form as an argument to the directive. So here we should reference our sign-up form, the property we created here, which stores our form. We're passing this via property binding to the form group, and now this form is actually synchronized with the form we created in TypeScript. But we still need to tell Angular which controls should be connected to which inputs in the template code. For this, we get another directive. On this input here, for example, the username, we add the form control name directive to tell Angular, hey, what's the name of this input in my form, in my TypeScript form? Well, the name is username, this name here, because that's the control I want to connect to this input. So I simply pass username here. If you're wondering why I'm not using property binding, I'm passing a string here. So if you want to use property binding, you can do this by wrapping this in squared brackets and then enclosing username in single quotation marks. Otherwise, it would search for a property named username. But this is overly complicated. If you just want to pass a string, simply omit these squared brackets and you're good to go. So with this, we're telling Angular, hey, my form should be connected to the form stored in the signup form property. And in this form, this input here should be connected to the control with the name username. Well, now I can simply repeat this for the email. Here the name was email, the name we set up here. Now this control is connected. And for the gender, of course. So on this input here, I will bind this to gender. Now with this, let's save this so that it compiles. And now let's have a look at it. We don't see any errors, which looks good. We see that male is pre-selected, looks promising because that was the default value we set when we created the control in TypeScript. And if I now switch to female, only one of the two is selected. We also see that if we select email here, that the Angular classes are attached, untouched, pristine, valid, and so on. So it indeed looks like our inputs in HTML are correctly synchronized to our form we created in TypeScript. So this was successful. The next step is to actually submit the form to see how this works. In the last lecture, we successfully synchronized our HTML form and our TypeScript form. Let's now have a look at how we can submit this form. In the template-driven approach, we used ng-submit, the ng-submit directive here on this form element. Well, we still do the same here, because we still want to react to this default submit event which is fired by HTML, by JavaScript. So we still add ng-submit here, and we could execute our onSubmit method, any method you like. So let's add this method here now, onSubmit. The difference to the template-driven approach now is that we don't need to get the form via this local reference. That actually wouldn't work anymore because we're not using Angular's auto creation mechanism. But we don't need to get this reference because, hey, we created the form on our own. We already got access to it here in our TypeScript code, actually in every method in the TypeScript code. So we can simply console log this sign up form, just like this. And this is how we get access to the form. Now, if we go back to our running project and we simply enter something here, switch this to female to see if it is correctly updated, and hit submit, we see our form group here. And it has the properties we already know, amongst them the value, which correctly represents the object we passed here. Key value pairs with username, email, and gender, and the appropriate values. This is the cool thing about the reactive approach. Whatever you set up here as an argument, whatever you set up here as an object you pass to the form group which makes up your form, that is what you get out as a value of the form. So you can bind it to your own model, the model of your application, and easily make sure that the form structure matches the structure of your model. So this is how you can submit the form, how you can still access the value as you did before, but now using your own form, the form you created in TypeScript. Now that we're able to submit a form, let's actually add some validation to it. In the template-driven approach, we would simply add required here, for example, to make this field required. It doesn't work like this in the reactive approach, because keep in mind, and that's key, you're not configuring the form in the template. You're only synchronizing it with the directives, form control name and form group, but you're not configuring it here. The TypeScript code, that is where you configure it. That is why form control takes more than one argument, this constructor here. You can not only set the default value, the second argument allows you to specify some validators. So you can either only pass one validator here, like for username, where I only want to make sure that it is required. And you do this by adding the validators object, make sure to import it from @AngularForms. And there you got a couple of built-in validators you can use, for example, required. Now make sure to not call it, to not execute it, so don't have parentheses after it, because you don't want to execute this method. It is a static method made available by validators here. Instead, you only want to pass the reference to this method. Angular will execute the method whenever it detects that the input of this form control changed. So it just needs to have a reference on what it should execute at this point of time. So this is the required validator, but as I said, this is only one option. You can also add multiple validators by simply passing an array of validators. So here to email, I'm going to pass an array of validators because I want to have the required validator, just like on the username, but I'll add another validator too here. I'll add the email validator. And this again also doesn't need to get executed, we just need the reference. So here I now also passed my validator, and now we do have validation in place. If we now go back to our form and we inspect and let it reload, and we inspect the email field here, for example, it's invalid. If I enter something here, it's still invalid. If I enter an email address though, it becomes valid. And the same, of course, for username. It's invalid right now. As soon as I enter something, it becomes valid because it's now not empty anymore. So this is how you can add validation to this approach.